If the rumours are right, Sony might be about to do a thing that a lot of people have been shouting at them to do for years. A new FX line camera, possibly called the FX5, possibly open gate, possibly global shutter, possibly something that looks less like an alpha camera with cinema features bolted onto it and more like a genuinely compact cinema camera that happens to sit inside the Sony ecosystem. And that is a very exciting sentence. It's also a sentence with a lot of possibly in it. So before anyone gets too cross, I have no inside information, none. I've been lucky enough to attend a Sony product launch recently, which was a genuine professional highlight for me, but that was in the alpha universe, around the A7R6, not an FX line, which is under Sony Pro. I've not been briefed on an FX5. Sony has sadly not slipped a prototype through my letterbox. I've not had a man in a black turtleneck invite me to a secret basement in Weybridge to whisper "global shutter" into my ear. I do live in hope though, obviously. But as of the time of recording this, what I know is what everybody else knows, which means what I know is not really knowledge at all. It's rumour, speculation, leaked fragments, internet noise, YouTube chatter, and that very particular form of camera world electricity that happens just before product cycle moves. So this obviously isn't a review, it's not a leak, it's definitely not a buyer's guide. It's a Western Approaches open channel style think out loud from someone who spent most of his video career using Sony cameras, while still also having an attachment to a RED Komodo X. Also, I'd just like to say today's episode has a sponsor, and that sponsor is me. But more on that later. When I say I'm a bit of a Sony man, I mean that in the Daniel Day-Lewis in There Will Be Blood sense. When he says I'm an oil man, you believe him. It's not a hobby, it's a condition. I'm not exclusively a Sony shooter. I have a RED Komodo X, I use that a lot professionally. I love the RED, I like the discipline of it, I love the image, I love the global shutter. I like the fact that it feels less like a consumer electronics object, more like a small rectangular box that has been reluctantly persuaded to make pictures. But for most of my video career, the cameras I've kept reaching for have been Sony's. I have an A7S III that I'm recording on now, I have an FX6, and more recently, thanks to Sony UK, I also have a ZV-E1, which remains one of the most ludicrous cameras I've ever used, because it's basically a tiny full-frame video monster hiding in the body of something that looks as though it might be bought by someone who says, "Content Day" out loud. And those cameras, all of them, broadly speaking, share a sensor architecture, a system, a look, and a way of working. The A7S III, the FX3, the FX6, ZV-E1 era of Sony video has been generation defining. I don't think that's too strong. There have been newer cameras from other manufacturers with more features, of course there have. There have been open gate modes, internal RAW options, lovely screens, lovely menus, clever stabilization systems, better codecs in some places, more aggressive pricing in others. Nikon has become suddenly interesting again, Canon's been moving, Panasonic Lumix has been banging the open gate drum with considerable success. But the Sony 12 megapixel full-frame video platform has had this absurdly long reign because the image is good, the low light is ridiculous, the autofocus is dependable and predictable, and the file sizes are sensible. And the cameras are small enough to travel with. The whole system just works. Not in a romantic spec sheet forum signature sense, in the more boring, more valuable sense. You turn up to a job, you take it out of the bag, it behaves itself, you get the footage, you go home. And that is a very, very, very difficult thing to beat. It's why, even with a Komodo X sitting up there looking expensive and serious and vaguely accusing, I still find myself reaching for the ZV-E1 far more often than I expected. Not because it's the best camera I own, because it's not. I reach for it because it's a tiny, stabilised, full-frame, autofocus, low-light Sony video machine that just makes a lot of my life easier. And that matters way more than most spec sheets admit. Which brings us to the rumoured FX5. Now, before I go much further, I did say that today's sponsor is me. So here is me briefly sponsoring myself. I built an app. That is still a slightly strange sentence to say out loud, but I did. It's called ColourTemp, and I made it because I kept running into the same problem on real shoots, particularly in extraordinary interiors, where the practical light fixtures are part of the whole point of the room. You turn up somewhere beautiful, the fixtures are important. The client likes them, the designer chose them, the atmosphere depends on them. And then you point a camera at them and discover that some horrible little pulse, or banding, or strobing, or flickering, weirdness that was completely invisible to your eye, and absolutely disgusting to your sensor. And the worst version of that scenario is when you only discover it in the edit. Because at that point the room is gone, the job's moved on, and one of your favourite angles has become unusable because a light fitting decides to have private episodes at exactly the wrong frequency. And I've actually encountered that a few times, and I've genuinely wanted to throw my studio display off the balcony. So, I've made a tool to save me from myself, and hopefully to save you from the same thing. Not save you from me, but save you from yourselves. ColourTemp lets you identify problematic fixtures quickly. You set your frame rate, you scan the light, and then the app helps you work out which shutter speed or shutter angle you can use to wrestle the pulsing, banding, strobing weirdness under control. That's the important bit. It doesn't just tell you there's a problem, it helps you solve it. And it gives you white balance readings too, hence the name. Ideally you take those from a white card or a grey card, because we're civilised people, but if you need a quick colour temperature reading from a fixture, you can do that as well. The app is called ColourTemp. I made it myself. It's been a real labour of love, and I'm enormously pleased with it, because it solves an issue I kept bumping into, and I figured if I was having the problem, other filmmakers probably were too. It's on the App Store now, and it's only a tenner. And yes, the name Flickr, frustratingly, was already taken. The interesting thing about this rumour isn't simply that Sony might be making a new FX camera. That was always going to happen at some point. The FX3 is not new, the FX6 is not new, the A7S III is now in camera years, practically something you might find in a museum next to a trilobite. The interesting thing is the shape of the rumour, because if the reports are even directionally correct, Sony's not just doing the conservative thing. The conservative thing would be an FX3 too. Same rough body, better autofocus, better menus, better screen, better thermal design, maybe improved stabilization, some AI subject recognition, a little badge, a few firmware features, and a launch video with a lot of creators singing its praises. That would be a very normal thing to do. Not necessarily a bad thing, probably actually a very good thing, but quite a safe thing. The FX5 rumour, though, suggests something much more interesting. A camera that sits above the FX3, possibly below the FX6, with more of the professional cinema language in the body, potentially open gate, potentially global shutter, potentially a more modular design, potentially something that owes as much to the Venice as it does to Alpha. If that's true, that is not just a replacement. That is Sony admitting and acknowledging that the market and what the market wants has moved. Or, more accurately, that the noise around the market has become too loud to ignore. If you're enjoying this slightly speculative camera therapy session, do give the video a like, subscribe if you want more working filmmaker judgment rather than pure spec sheet excitement, and leave a comment with your prediction for the FX5 price, because I think that might be the most revealing part of the whole thing. Between uploads, I'm on Instagram as Jack Filmed, where there's more behind the scenes, sort of camera type nonsense, bits from paid work, occasionally RNLI stuff, evidence that I am as susceptible to nice equipment as I claim not to be. Let's talk OpenGate. OpenGate is one of those features that I've never personally been desperate for, which is a strange thing to admit on the internet because it makes people behave as though you've walked into a cathedral and insulted stained glass. For anybody that doesn't live inside the camera community comment sections, OpenGate essentially means using the full height and width of the sensor for video, rather than reading out a conventional 16:9 or 17:9 crop. That can be very useful because it gives you more flexibility for reframing, it helps if you need horizontal and vertical deliverables from the same shot, it can be excellent for anamorphic work, and it can give you a taller frame, more options in post, more creative freedom, more ways to extract different compositions from one capture. So I get it, I really do. In my own work, it has never been a missing piece. I shoot interiors, commercial films, documentary style work, boats, hospitality, bits of YouTube, the occasional waterproofing crisis, and I have rarely come home thinking, man, if only I had OpenGate, this whole thing would have been saved. That said, if you zoom out beyond my own use, the appetite for OpenGate is clearly enormous. There is a portion of the video community for whom OpenGate has become almost a moral imperative. OpenGate or nothing. OpenGate or death. OpenGate or I shall stand outside of Sony headquarters with a placard and thermos until someone lets me use the full sensor height. People really do bang on about it. And that's coming from me, someone who's very clearly trying to build an audience around banging on about things. The difference, I think, is that OpenGate has moved from being a niche technical requirement into being a perceived ecosystem barrier. People may not need it every day, they may not even use it properly when they have it, but they have started to treat the absence of it as evidence that a camera is not sufficiently modern, flexible, creator-friendly, or filmmaker-aware. And that's a bit of a problem for Sony, because for years, Sony's had one of the strongest video ecosystems in the world, but they have sometimes appeared oddly resistant to features that the loudest end of the market keeps asking for. And if Sony has finally decided to put OpenGate into a compact FX camera, That is not them losing an argument. That is them doing what serious companies do when the market tells them something often enough, deciding whether a feature has become strategically important, even if not every user personally needs it. I may not wake up craving OpenGate, but if I were designing a modern FX camera in 2026, I would have to take it seriously. Because the camera doesn't just have to work for me, it has to tempt the person who's been looking at Lumix bodies, Nikon bodies, Canon cinema hybrids, and thinking, Sony looks great, but why won't they give me the thing that everyone else is offering? Then there's global shutter, and that for me is much more interesting. A global shutter sensor captures the whole frame at once, rather than scanning down the image line by line in the way that a rolling shutter sensor does. The practical benefit is that fast movement, whip pans, flashing lights, and certain motion artifacts are handled very differently. Vertical lines stay vertical, motion feels cleaner, there's no jello wobble, no skew. Now, the current Sony full-frame video cameras are not exactly disasters in rolling shutter terms. The FX6, A7S III, FX3, ZV-E1 family is very good. The readout is fast, the image holds up beautifully. For a lot of work, rolling shutter is not really something I think about with those cameras. It's not like using some ancient hybrid camera where a quick pan makes a lamppost look as though it's trying to escape the frame, but there is a difference between very little and none. And it's a very small difference, but the trouble is, small differences are sometimes where the entire feeling of an image lives, and that's part of why I like the Komodo X so much. I don't think that the Komodo X image is only about global shutter. It's Super 35, which I think is a bigger part of the character than people often admit. It has red colour, it has red code raw, it has a very specific way of rendering, and it encourages a different kind of shooting. It slows you down in some useful ways. But the global shutter definitely matters. It gives motion a different quality, and it removes a layer of digital compromise that most of us have learned to ignore because we've just had to. When you see global shutter footage, especially in the sort of movement that might otherwise show rolling shutter distortion, it can feel subtly but discernibly solid. Not cinematic because of magic, not filmic because of vibes and grain, just cleaner in motion. The frame feels as though it's arriving as one piece. And that's the sort of thing that's very hard to sell in spec table terms, but it can matter enormously when you spend a lot of time looking and appreciating footage. And Sony has actually already brought a full-frame global shutter into the alpha world, so it's not science fiction, it's not an internet fantasy, it exists in a real Sony camera. If that technology, or a newer version of it, ends up in an FX5 shaped cinema body, that becomes very compelling indeed. Because global shutter in a compact full-frame FX camera is not just a headline feature, it changes the kind of compromises you're making. It means handheld work, car work, fast movement, action, gimbal moves, water, documentary, practical lights, production environments, all start to feel a little less compromised. Again, not always dramatically, but enough. So the real question is not whether the FX5 has OpenGate or global shutter or a particular number of K. The real question is what professional problem does it solve that existing cameras do not? The real question is what professional problem or problems does it solve that existing Sony cameras do not? Because the current Sony video ecosystem is already extremely strong. The A7S III still works, the FX3 still works, the FX6 still works, the ZV-E1 is still absurdly capable for its size. This is one of the reasons I get slightly irritated when people accuse Sony of falling behind every time they go more than 5 minutes without launching a new video body. Sony's been accused for a while of resting on its laurels. The argument goes, Canon is moving, Nikon is moving, Panasonic has OpenGate, Sony is stale, Sony is conservative, Sony is being leapfrogged. I understand why people say that, but I think it underestimates the value of building cameras that stay relevant for a very long time. The A7S III was not a minor release. The FX6 was not a minor release. The FX3 was not a minor release. That sensor platform has carried professional, semi-professional, YouTube, documentary, commercial, wedding, corporate, expedition, new style, low-light travel, and creator work for years. A camera system that remains desirable 6 years later is not a failure of innovation. It is evidence that the original product was very, very, very good. So yes, a tiny, petty, deeply unattractive part of me would like to follow up every comment I had last year from people saying Sony was finished, Sony was doomed, Sony had lost the plot, with a simple, I did, in fact, tell you so. Maybe with stronger language. But I will resist, because I'm dignified, or trying to be, mostly. Of course, this entire section may age like milk in a warm car if the FX5 turns out to be an FX3 with better Wi-Fi, and a bigger tally light, no OpenGate, no global shutter, and a menu item called Creator Mode Pro, in which case I will eat my blue hat. But the direction of travel, if the rumours are right, suggests Sony has been doing what Sony often does, not necessarily being the first to every feature, not necessarily indulging every comment section demand immediately, but waiting until it can release something that feels complete enough to reset that conversation. That is a very Sony move. Sometimes infuriating, often effective. Before we get carried away, price matters. This camera, if it exists in the form being rumoured, is not going to be cheap. I would be amazed if Sony looked at a compact FX body with global shutter, open gate, more professional cinema design, E-mount, high-end processing, serious thermal requirements, and thought, let's make this a bargain. The price of everything is high. Sensors are expensive. Processing is expensive. Memory bandwidth is expensive. Heat management is expensive. The RAM in my Mac Studio already feels like it's been priced by a cartel of Bond villains. Then you add Sony's professional positioning. Sony doesn't need to win this by being the cheapest. Nikon and Canon have put out some very aggressively priced, very interesting products recently. That's good. The market needs the pressure. It needs options. It needs companies making each other uncomfortable. But Sony's FX line has always had a different sort of gravity. Used FX6s still command serious money. FX3s hold their value. A7S3s still refuse to become cheap in the way you might expect. And that's partly brand, partly ecosystem, partly trust, I think, partly because working shooters don't tend to sell cameras that are still making the money unless they have a good reason to. If the FX5 is genuinely positioned above the FX3, with global shutter and a more cinema-led design, I would expect it to be painfully priced. Not absurd, necessarily, but painful enough that the question will not be, can I afford it? The real question will be, what do I sell to make room for it? Which is where it gets dangerous, because camera buying at this level is rarely only rational. We like to try and pretend it is. We might make spreadsheets, we talk about codecs and dynamic range and shutter readout and flange distance and taxable business expenses. Part of the buying decision is always emotional. Does this camera make me want to work? Does it make the job feel better? Does it remove anxiety? Does it make me more likely to say yes to a difficult shoot? Does it make me feel prepared? Does it earn its place? And that last question is always the one that I care about the most. A camera doesn't earn its place by having the most features. It earns its place by making itself useful under pressure. The FX6 has earned its place because it's practical. The A7S III has earned its place because it's dependable. The ZV-E1 has weirdly earned a place because it's so small and so capable that taking it feels like cheating. The Komodo X earns its place when I want the discipline, the image, the global shutter, the raw workflow, the more serious and nuanced shooting experience. So the FX5, as rumoured, has to do more than just excite the internet. It has to justify itself in a real bag, on a real job, with real compromises. That's why the Sony ecosystem matters so much. E-mount is one of Sony's greatest competitive advantages. It has become a genuinely extraordinary lens ecosystem, partly because Sony made it open enough for other manufacturers to build interesting things for it. You have first-party G-Master lenses, you have Sigma, Tamron, Samyang, Viltrox, Laowa, Sirui, Typok, weird lenses, cheap lenses, expensive lenses, sensible zooms, fast primes, tiny autofocus lenses, manual cinema-adjacent things, anamorphic options, lenses that probably shouldn't exist that somehow they do. And that's a big deal, because a camera body is never just a body. It's the mount, the batteries, the menus, the adapters, the cages, the monitors, the audio options, the resale value, the files, and the way it integrates with everything else in your life. This is one reason OpenGate on a Sony could become genuinely exciting, even for someone like me, who's not historically cared very much. OpenGate on a system with a constrained lens ecosystem is one thing, Lumix. OpenGate on E-mount is another thing entirely, because suddenly you have this enormous range of glass, including more affordable, more experimental, more compact, more peculiar options, all connected to a camera that might offer the full sensor readout people have been asking for. That is really interesting. The people who care about anamorphic will care. The people who deliver vertical and horizontal versions of the same shoot will care. The people who like reframing will care. The people who want to shoot once and extract multiple formats will care. I might end up caring more than I think, which is usually how these things begin. A feature you didn't think you needed becomes something you use once, then twice, and then suddenly every camera without it feels slightly compromised. That is how they get you. The thing I keep coming back to is this. Camera rumours are only really useful when they force you to examine your own priorities. OpenGate has asked me whether I have been underestimating flexibility. Global shutter has made me think about why I respond so strongly to the Komodo X image. A more professional compact FX body would make me question how much I actually need from a cinema camera beyond image, reliability, I/O, ergonomics, and a workflow that doesn't make me want to walk straight into the sea. The price will be the thing that makes me question whether business expense is a phrase I'm able to use responsibly. But beneath all that, the FX5 Rumour is interesting because it sits right at the intersection of hype and real professional need. And that is a dangerous place to be. Some camera hype is nonsense, obviously. A lot of it exists to make perfectly good tools feel obsolete. It convinces people that the camera they bought 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, has suddenly become redundant and an embarrassment, which is preposterous. But sometimes a new camera release does matter. Sometimes a product doesn't merely add a feature, it changes the shape of your entire decision-making process. The FX6 did that. The A7S III did that. I don't have an FX3, but I know that the FX3 did that for a certain kind of shooter. The ZV-E1, in its own small, ridiculous, sometimes overheating way, does that too. If the FX5 combines the small camera practicality of Sony's video line with some of the motion advantages of global shutter, the flexibility of OpenGate, the lens ecosystem of E-mount, and a more professional cinema layout, then it could be yet another proper inflection point dealt by the hand of Sony. Not for everybody, no camera is for everybody, but for the sort of person who wants one compact professional camera that can live between YouTube, commercial work, travel and documentary, paid shoots, gimbal work, handheld work, low light work, and maybe even slightly more serious cinema-style productions, I have no doubt it will be very hard to ignore. And that's why I'm excited. Not because I think everyone should buy it, not because I think every Sony shooter needs an upgrade, not because I think OpenGate is going to save Western civilization. I don't. I think civilization is doomed. But more because the rumoured FX5 sounds like Sony is looking at the complaints, the competition, the feature gaps, the loyalty of its existing users, and saying, fine, let's make the awkward one. The one that doesn't simply replace the FX3. The one that makes FX3 users think. The one that makes FX6 users think. The one that makes Komodo X owners like me start glancing nervously at MPV. That is good camera drama. And because this is the internet, drama is apparently what we have instead of proper hobbies. So I genuinely love to know what you think. Does OpenGate matter to you, or has the internet made it feel more important than it is? Is global shutter the feature that would make you seriously consider a new Sony body? Would an FX5 tempt you away from an FX3, FX6, Canon, Nikon, Lumix, RED, Blackmagic, or whatever else you're using? How expensive is too expensive? And if you're already in the Sony ecosystem, what would this camera need to do before it became a real purchase, rather than just another thing to watch videos about at 1 in the morning while making sort of half-hearted, irresponsible financial plans? For me, the answer is pretty simple. If the rumours are wrong, then this has been a fun thought experiment, and I will accept the appropriate level of mockery. If the rumours are right, then Sony might be about to release one of the most interesting compact cinema cameras it has made in years. And I may have to have a very serious conversation with myself, my accountant, and the expensive red, black rectangle currently sat on the desk upstairs. I'm Jack. Whatever this is, I'm calling Western Approaches Open Channel. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.